Hello, everybody. I have something for you that I think you might find maybe useful. I'm calling it tentatively the macro trick, and what it is well, what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna try to analyze a method that a lot of would-be tyrants try to use to obscure and obfuscate things, usually, generally to their advantage in arguments or in, say, statistics. There's so just to kind of give a little background, everybody kind of agrees on the principles of like microeconomics, right? That if Bob has some goods, some set of goods, and Jim has some other set of goods, and they trade voluntarily, that they're winning, that they must both be winning in order for it to be a voluntary trade, right? Assuming that there's no duress involved in any sense. All of these principles of microeconomics seem to actually work. But when you go into macroeconomics, like Keynesianism, you get a lot of really bizarre answers sometimes. Like the Keynes's so-called paradox of saving. And frankly, the reason that you get these paradoxes, these complexities, these confusions, is because if you combine things that are fundamentally different, you end up with a a macro object that doesn't make sense. So, a lot of people who want to get control over other people will use this trick. They'll combine unlike things to make something that has paradoxes, or at the very least has the behavior that they want. And what are their goals for doing this? Well, number one, they like to obscure differences for rhetorical purposes. As you can see in this picture here, we have the confusion between the state and society. The state is not society. The society is the people and their voluntary interactions. The state is the involuntary, supposed or desired owner of those people. The Philippines government is a state. The Philippines people are not a state. They might be a nation, but they're not a state. Another thing that they like to do is they like to selectively unpack and repack things when convenient. So I've got a couple pictures here. STEM versus STEAM. Does the A matter? A meaning arts, right? Well, it's not that the A doesn't matter. It's that the A is a categorically different object. The arts have a different means for operation than science, mathematics, engineering. They are more open-ended. That doesn't mean that they don't matter. But it does mean that they're different. And they attempt to lump arts into the hard sciences and call them the same, or put them together, is an attempt to pack things up when it's convenient. So, for instance, to get more funding for arts would be a good reason to do that. And unpack them when it's inconvenient. That is, when anybody says anything objective about arts, they say, well, it's just art. And they unpack it conveniently for themselves. The other picture here is a quote by Dennis Miller, and Dennis Miller's, fun to listen to in general, but here he's saying, of course, that's just my opinion, I could be wrong. Well, there are a lot of people who will say things that appear to be factual statements, but when pressed on them, will simply say, oh, that's just an opinion, even though it's basically a factual statement, and there's no indicator that it's an opinion until you push on it. Finally, another goal for doing this would be to create an illusion of simplicity or tractability. Here's a picture of John Maynard Keynes, and what Keynesian economics does is it takes principles of microeconomics, pushes things that don't fit together, forces them together, and then makes this big nonsensical jigsaw puzzle that doesn't really fit or look right, and ends up with a bunch of weird, absurd statements that then gets called economic theory, right? So, I think a brief examination of the faults of Keynesianism is probably a good way to start here. So, in Keynesian economics, you have variables, and you have a limited number of variables because the idea is to make large economic effects tractable or modelable. So you have W, which is all wages. Everything from non-skilled labor up to the highest, most specialized skilled labor all gets lumped together in W. I, all investment, considering the fact that different types of investment exist and that they can be more or less useful. This is worth, it doesn't make sense to put all investment together in one variable, but there it is. S, all savings. Well, not all savings are the same, right? Some savings are savings in banks. Some savings are people putting money in their mattress or burying it in the backyard. Some savings are denominated in gold. Some savings are denominated in equities. Some savings are denominated in real estate. I don't know, whatever you want to say. Then you've got K, all aggregate capital. And K is the real killer here, right? Because what K says is that $1 million worth of shovels is the same as $1 million worth of factory or varied capital suited to current conditions. In Keynesian economics, at least in the most macro version of it, all capital goods are treated as one big aggregate. And in fact, this is one of its major mistakes. It treats capital as one big thing bearing or producing interest, but in fact, the interest that you get from $1 million worth of shovels, or the return on investment that you get from $1 million worth of shovels, would be very different from $1 million of investment into a new factory that is designed to deal with current economic conditions. So you can see where you can get confused here. You can have companies or actors that have aggregate capital, but that aggregate capital is not the right kind of aggregate capital. And because you're aggregating, you're putting good capital and useless capital together and calling it all the same thing, which is why you get stuff like all the different paradoxes that show up in Keynesianism. Of course, when you're crafting a mathematical model, controlling complexity is important. If there are too many independent variables, you can make a problem unsolvable, or you can create a problem that has like an infinite spectrum of solutions. Both of these are not especially useful to people in general. Justified simplification, simplifications that make sense and don't significantly affect the behavior of the model, or don't significantly deviate from reality, can simplify a model in useful ways. Imagine the position as a function of time, right, of a steel ball bearing as it falls through space. For a steel ball bearing, it has very little wind resistance, and if you're looking at it over a fairly short period of time, that wind resistance is negligible compared to the force of gravity, right? In addition, the steel ball bearing is dense, and so it's less affected. It has higher mass, and therefore is less affected by wind resistance. But if we make the same assumption or the same simplification for a feather falling in air, now we've created a model with solutions that don't reflect reality. If you tried to look at the position as a function of time of a feather falling in air, you won't get this simple equation. You'll get something very different. So, collectivists, socialists, authoritarians, and other central planners always want solutions that suit their ends. They always want to increase their power. They always want to increase their control. They always want to make themselves more vital to society. If the solutions that they give you are too simple, it'll be obviously wrong, and people will be able to tell. Here we have a picture of some people suffering from the Ukraine famine back in the 1930s. If the solution is too complex, there won't be any solutions. You can, in fact, create mathematical problems to which there's no solution, and the best you can do is a numerical solution, and even that can be tricky sometimes. So, what the central planners want is they want a sweet spot solution. It's a solution that's complex enough to lock out 99% of the people who are not willing to actually analyze it, but it justifies their ends, and it creates a desire or a demand for a large class of administrators and technocrats. Here we've got a picture of FDR signing something related to the New Deal. There are other examples of unjustified conflation to talk about, right? We can justify, people like to call social science science. But the fact is that something that is very simple and useful, like PV equals nRT, the ideal gas law, is very different from these plots that have no real numbers on their axes and are just illustrating, a hypothetical relationship between certain things that you can't even really measure, right? Like, you can't really measure a supply curve in reality because things are moving around all the time. And yet we have these plots in economics. So what you're doing is you're ignoring differences in methodology, right? You're looking at things that you can do the scientific method with, that you can make testable hypotheses with, that you can perform isolated experiments with, to things where you can't do any of that stuff. You can't do clean tests in social science. All you can do is look at historical data and try to manipulate them to see whether they fit or don't fit your particular theory. But in general, there's usually so much data and so many things that conflict with each other, so many so many external variables that you can't, control, that you can find examples of whatever you want if you are looking at it that way. What you're also doing, and this is a little bit more in the gray area, is you're providing a special type of legitimacy. It's not that social science is illegitimate. A social scientist who can actually make predictions and make statements about the future and make, even one who can make interesting conclusions about things that happened in the past are interesting and legitimate. But what calling social sciences science has a tendency to do is provide extra legitimacy, this special scientific legitimacy for social scientists regardless of their method or their accuracy. Of course, the other thing that you're doing here is you're conflating complicated humans, complicated, unpredictable, spiteful humans with inanimate objects, right? A steel ball dropped in, will fall. A human being under some stimulus may choose to go along with the stimulus, may choose to spitefully oppose the stimulus, may choose to ride it out. There's all kinds of different behaviors that a single individual can have. And these behaviors don't allow a clean test in social sciences where you're dealing with people. And of course, the other thing that this does is it gives the illusion of certainty to social science predictions. If you look at people who are working for the state, they'll say, "Oh, there's no evidence that there's a systematic issue with the banking system, just as they did in 2006 and 2007." When in fact, there were plenty of people who were giving information about data that would suggest that there was a problem with the banking system. But these social scientists said, "Oh, there's no data," therefore they had this illusion of certainty that gave them the ability to kind of push things out further than they otherwise might have. The other thing that this does is it confuses language in general, right? Science is a fairly narrow process, right? Hypothesis, testing, retesting, controlled experiments, that kind of stuff. When you call things that don't use the scientific method science, it's confusing language in general. And we all know that socialists love to confuse language in general. Another example, settled science. Here we've got the ideal gas law versus, a shyster like Fauci. What you can do here is you can ignore reproducibility history. For instance, you can look at masking, but only the studies that were made in the last year count for masking. The 90-year studies that we've done with influenza, those don't count. You can conflate uncertain, poorly established conclusions with well-tested, long-established conclusions, right? Like, nobody really doubts that, in the low velocity limit that Newtonian physics works, right? P equals mv, kinetic energy, how gravity works, near the surface of the Earth when neglecting, wind resistance, stuff like that. By calling poorly established conclusions like masks work on COVID with well-tested, long-established conclusions like entropy or, conservation of momentum, you put these two things together, you call them the same, and the average person doesn't realize the difference. Another thing that the phrase settled science does is it sidesteps the scientific method. The notion of the scientific method is that nothing is ever settled. Everyone knows that. Everyone who understands science at all knows that. But by calling the science settled, what you do is you give a certain group the ability to determine what science is settled. And of course, the technocrats and the state will make that decision, and they'll do it to their advantage in general. Another thing that this does is it allows you to ignore cost-benefit analyses. It turns a weak is into a strong ought, right? that there is a single study that suggests that COVID might be reduced by masking, by lockdowns, turns into a strong ought by which these politicians tell you that you have to stay in your house under penalty of under whatever penalty they decide is acceptable. I mentioned this earlier, but another thing that gets conflated a lot is society, the people, with the state, the aggressor. So what this does is it mixes together voluntary associations with involuntary interactions and puts them together in one big thing so that everybody gets confused about which is which. It elevates the state from a stationary bandit to a leader, right? It turns Joe Biden into some kind of leader when all he really does is hold guns at the heads of everybody you can see in the street on the bottom image. It conflates culture, the creation of goods, the creation of art, the creation of the interactions of people, the way that people interact with each other, the way that people choose not to interact with each other. It conflates that with theft, taxation by the state. It creates obligations, because if the state is society, then you can have obligations to the state. And of course the state decides what those obligations are. Jury duty, conscription, the draft, things like that. Another thing, a little bit deeper here, it creates a target for outside generalizations. If the state conflates itself with society, then the enemies that the state creates see the people that it is lording over as potential enemies. For example, if we look at what the U.S. government did to the people of Afghanistan, it is perfectly reasonable for the people of Afghanistan to hate and feel that they've been wronged by the state. But because the state conflates itself with American society in general, those same people in Afghanistan have a reason to see the people of America, especially since America is hypothetically a democratic country, right? Those people in Afghanistan have a reason to transfer that negative feeling towards innocent people in America who have nothing to do with what the U.S. government did to them. Another good example, systemic anything. What this does is it combines rare phenomena with common ones and then equalizes them, right? So, lynchings. Everybody thinks lynchings are bad, right? But like someone being discreetly followed in a retail store is considerably less bad than lynching. But if we combine these two things into systemic racism, then what an activist will do is basically equalize someone getting followed in a retail store with lynching, and they just combine them under the same statistic. Well, these are instances of racist behavior. It converts what's usually a person-by-person problem to a pervasive issue, right? The number of people in America who actually have significant, how do I put this? Certainly, all the people who support affirmative action are racists, but they don't consider themselves racist. They consider this as a retribution or a return for previous injustices. If we go with that kind of definition of racism, just for the sake of argument, there are very few people in America who actually have these negative racist beliefs against minorities. They do exist, but they're pretty few and far between. But if you call it systemic racism, then what they can do is they can paint everyone with that same racist moniker. If it's systemic, you can dismiss counterexamples, because what you can do is you can paint all opposing facts as anecdotal that don't overwhelm the issue, the systemic issue that you're facing, right? You hear that language a lot. And of course, what this also does is it creates a demand for experts, technocrats, and administrators. It ignores individual solutions, right? We have these people who are pushing this systemic racism narrative, and their answer is always a collectivist solution. It's always that we need more reparations, we need more affirmative action, we need more injustice in the other direction. And all this does is create a backlash or a failure to convince, right? people say that such and such a group is underrepresented among PhD physicists, and this is despite a huge affirmative action push to get more of these people into PhD physics. This is ignoring the fact that practically every professor wants more minority students because there's a lot of advantages to having minority students as students. What this basically does is it creates, or at least encourages, like a revenge spiral. I oppress you, you oppress me, I oppress you, you oppress me. Whereas the actual solution, the individual solution, is that individual racists can be, shunned or, at least told that they're going down the wrong path. Or, individuals or small groups of individuals can remove themselves from places or people who have these kind of beliefs. And none of these things require aggressive action or like legal effects like affirmative action. And, if you just get people to stop doing it eventually, gradually, then you don't have any group of people that feels that they've been wronged in the past now and that they need revenge after that. One recent one, the conflation of peaceful protest with riot. Of course, what this does, that the state loves, is it blurs the lines of law, property, and violence. It allows biased reporters to convert violent acts into so-called nonviolent protests. It allows different events to be lumped together. January 6th, there's violent events happening on one side of this gigantic building and nonviolent events happening on the other side of this gigantic building. They can clump these two things together, call it a riot or an insurrection or whatever they want to call it. And what this does is it allows for people who didn't do anything violent to be treated as if they did. It encourages selective reporting, as we've seen. The flamboyant imagery of the violent parts of January 6th are now being countered with the nonviolent images of that Q shaman dude. And of course, this is all just fodder for propaganda, and the government or the state loves propaganda. We've got this picture here, this very famous picture about fiery but mostly peaceful protests. Fiery in the most literal sense, right? And of course, in these riots, there were people who were nonviolent, but there was a significant group of people who were committing arson, assault, vandalism, all kinds of really awful acts. And lumping these people together and calling them peaceful is just as wrong as lumping another group of people together who are also in a variety of positions and calling it all violent. All of this is just propaganda. And then here's one, trans man and man. It does not follow, logically, that an atypical woman is a man. It ignores the spectrum of human behavior and interaction. I'd say that a person doesn't get to control the definitions of words. This is another thing that socialists love to do. They love to control the definitions and implications of words. If you go along with that, then what you're ending up doing is you're combining things that aren't alike and calling them alike. And I'm not trying to use atypical in a negative sense either, right? Like, just an unfeminine woman is not necessarily a man. This is Another thing is that this is unobservable and untestable truth, right? A person merely has to identify as such in order to gain the advantage of the other group. I mean, look, you don't get to control definitions of words, or at least the average person shouldn't get the ability to control definitions of words, and definitions of words should not be changed lightly, right? The issue that's going on here, right, is that I would actually argue that you kind of have a right to say that you're not part of a group, right? Like, if you are an unfeminine woman and you don't feel like you're a woman, you can at least say, I don't feel like I'm part of that group. I agree, you can even agree that the most biological definition that technically you're in that group, but that you feel wrong with it. That does not give you the ability or the right to enter into a different group and claim ownership or membership in that group, right? So this is the main problem here, right? You have people who are claiming that they aren't part of Group A, therefore they're part of Group B, when those don't follow. Another thing that this does is that it demands others play along, right? Because of social pressures and such. The idea is that people have to, use other people's pronouns as they demand or whatever. And of course, the negative here is that it allows bad actors to claim immunity to censure, right? Because this is unobservable, because this is untestable, because this flies in the face of biology. Bad actors, of which, perhaps in fact, probably it's a significant minority of the people that we're dealing with. But there exist bad actors who look at something like this as an opportunity to do what they want to do without being seen as negative by the rest of society. Another thing this does is it feeds fragility and paranoia, right? Like, you don't get to claim that you're in danger if you're not. The notion that someone disagrees with you philosophically or about whether the particular feelings that you have are real or some kind of mental illness or what does not give you the right to claim that your existence is in danger. This is just another thing that the state loves to do. It loves to make its people dependent on it for protection and then fail to provide protection in specific areas. Another thing this does is it creates an additional state-protected class. And if there's one thing that we don't need, it's more state-protected classes. And of course, this encourages hypersensitivity to minor differences. We're seeing examples of people who are exhibiting very minor differences from stereotypical behavior of some group and are being told that they need to enter into this other group, despite the fact that the behavior differences are very minor. Here I'm just going to throw out another list of a couple of other examples. Not too much analysis, but we've got conflation of sex with gender. And if you look up the etymology of the use of the word gender with respect to people and society, it's pretty awful. Whereas sex is just a basic biological statement and isn't really that confusing. We've got racism and prejudice plus power. Right? Now what we can do with prejudice plus power is we can exclude certain groups from claiming victimhood of racism. Then we can commit racism or racist policies against them, and they don't get to fight back. We've got the conflation of mental illness and evil. Just because a person has a mental illness doesn't necessarily make them evil. It's what they do with it that makes them evil. Even a paranoid schizophrenic, if they recognize that their paranoia doesn't justify them harming other people, real or imagined, they can still live a productive and reasonable life. You don't call a person evil because they have depression. You don't call a person evil because they're paranoid. I don't know why I pronounced it like that. There's a lot going on here, right? That you don't want to conflate these two things because some mental illnesses can be fixed. Another good one is anti-socialist and fascist, right? So the fact that so fascism is not free market, right? Fascist is basically socialism without the immediate grabbing of capital goods by the state, right? In fascism, the corporation maintains de jure ownership of the capital, but if they go against the state, then they can easily be appropriated. Socialism, on the other hand, is the government ownership of the means of production, and this completely ignores the other side, where the government is minimal, or even the state, the coercive state is minimal or non-existent. You're still going to have government, but you can have free market or voluntary forms of government as opposed. And therefore, being anti-socialist is not the same thing as fascist, and being anti-fascist is not the same thing as being free market or being socialist, or anyway. Another one that I've seen before, which is really weird, is that some people conflate leftism with good. I've actually seen videos of people saying, because it's left, it's good. And this is another conflation that's completely unjustified. Collectivism and other forms of, let's say, coercive equity formation are definitely not good. They're theft, they're slavery, they're conscription, they're kidnapping. And we don't want to conflate those two things. The conflation of law and morality. Things that are legal are not necessarily good, and things that are evil are not necessarily illegal, and but the sooner people can get that through their heads, the better. I have a video about this topic in particular. I'll put a link in the description. But kind of more delving into this question at all. And then we've got the conflation of a different perspective with a phobia. Believing that someone has a mental illness as opposed to being a different thing than they actually are does not mean that one is afraid of that group. So, I always try to finish these kinds of videos with some kind of like, what can we do? Well, the most important thing to do is to just have caution. We need to look for these kinds of combinations being made rhetorically and consider whether they apply. We need to persistently question attempts to combine things to determine or to at least push back against the combination of things that aren't like each other. You know, if the person that you're talking to is making some kind of rhetorical combination of two things and they can't tell you why those two things belong together, that is a problem. Attacking logically at the fundamental level. Argumentation is underestimated. The fact is that there are a group of people who are so into this kind of nonsense, or who are so corrupted by their desire to rule or own other people, that they won't be convinced. But there is a significant group of fence sitters who are receptive to logical, rhetorical, and even emotional arguments at the fundamental level about these kinds of things. So whenever you see these kind of combinations being done, say something about it. Don't just let it pass. And say something about it at the fundamental level, too. Don't say that in this particular case, this is wrong because. Go straight to the root and just say, this is combining two things that are fundamentally different. This is combining X and Y, and they're not the same, and we can't do that. It doesn't make sense. It creates the opportunity for paradoxes, for logical inconsistencies, all kinds of stuff like that. Then we've got illustrate and emphasize differences and simplifications. Simply taking examples like this and piecing them out like I have done in some of the earlier examples can help people understand why these things are different and why plugging them together like this is not the best idea. So definitely the more you can actually illuminate this kind of stuff to people. Again, those fence sitters, like it or not, there is a significant amount of, you would call it, democratic control of the world these days. And if you can actually convince people that these things, that these unlike things don't belong together, you can actually make a difference. And that's all I've got. What can I say? This macro trick, this act of combining unlike things to get a rhetorical win is something that is extremely important to pay attention to and to avoid whenever, or to attack whenever you can. So I hope that with this video I've kind of given you some examples, given you some food for thought, given you some ideas of what to do, because the more we can argue effectively against this kind of stuff, the better. So, as always, thanks for dropping by, and I'll see you next time.